I'm coming in. Eric has been one of my unknown, perhaps not known by him, but he's been one of my heroes in this work because he was truly a pioneer in understanding the kind of implications of extreme climate events on the inequitable distribution of effects. And that was really at the core of a lot of the work that has been born since. And at least with our research group, we've been digging deep into this um, spatial inequity question quite a bit. And before I go on too much further, I just again want to recognize that this is about trying to identify not only the spatial injustices that we are describing, but many of these themes of marginalization, erasure, and dispossession that were brought up during the keynote addresses. And I'd really, as a sociospatial scientist, I am looking at empirical ways of describing some of these patterns that we're talking about. And today, the presentation about community-based participatory climate science is really about taking climate science out of this highly technical, incredibly deep scientific question, which I think is laudable and important, and then bringing it into the hands of the people and trying to understand it through these distributional inequities that are emerging as we speak. A little bit about me before I get started. I grew up in South India, just a few degrees above the equator, where it's hot and where it's humid and where the mangoes are now ripening in January instead of March, as they have for a very long time. And these lived experiences of place that I had as a child were really about the ecologies of place, the way in which the trees, the cows, the chickens, the monkeys that lived right next door to our apartment complex were constantly in and around us as I traversed the landscape to grade school every day. So this was kind of my reckoning with space and seeing that we share this space with so many other, not only humans, but other species in and around our human-dominated landscapes, as I like to call them. I went from here after a decade or so, and my parents immigrated to here, Northern California, where as I was mentioning, the landscapes were completely different than what I had understood and what I'd seen. And these landscapes were far more clearly delineated in the sense of where people were allowed to be, where cars were allowed to be, where bikers and rollers were allowed to be. This was a very different experience altogether. And it rattled me from a very early age of trying to reconcile these two different ways to navigate space and place and what meanings were imbued to a place. The house that my parents were born in is a house that was from my grandmother's and great-grandmother's time. And that was really something that was part of a lineage of naming of children by the house to which they were born. And so my parents have as their first names the house that they were born to as their initials before their given name. And so the house and the place really matters when it comes to trying to recognize what part of a place does one come from. And that's something I've been trying to make sense of in the US ever since my parents immigrated. And so more recently, after my dissertation and kind of really setting myself up here in Portland, Oregon, I really defined myself as an urban ecologist, as a sociospatial urban ecologist that draws on theories of social marginalization, adaptive management, and community resilience to identify the ways in which historical and current day policy structures generate distributional injustices. Although I'm focusing on urban areas, I'm not privileging them. I do recognize the interconnectedness across landscapes and the planet. Though urban areas allow me to study landscape transformation, power sharing, and as centers of cultural diversity, which really allow us to move into this dialogue about the implications of local decisions. And I'm keenly interested in studying, and I spend most of my time studying at this point, the climate-induced extreme events as a way for understanding social and spatial structures in urban areas, and how those amplify or create a distribution of benefits and burdens across the landscape. And so with that kind of background, I want to dive into a case study here about trying to, again, reconcile these landscapes. This is much like what Eric was talking about. These landscapes, just a mile apart or even across the street in many cases, look so different. I've had the privilege of being able to walk through dozens, if not hundreds of cities around the world, and trying to gauge what are the ways in which these landscapes actually distribute their infrastructure. What are the ways in which the trees, in this case, that completely cover one street to the left of the screen are not present on the right of the screen, whereas neighborhoods just a block or two away look very different in terms of what is present, what are the kinds of infrastructures that communities have access to, many of the things that Eric was just bringing up in terms of how we make decisions and what places end up looking like. So to get into this kind of legacy of what we're all kind of trying to navigate through a lot of historical dispossession, erasure, and marginalization that's occurred, we embarked upon a study to try to ground this in one of the most compelling and profound challenges I think that we have in front of us, and this time where the infrastructure and historic marginalization have kind of come together to really amplify some of these impacts, much of what we're talking about today. And so this project really embarked upon an ambitious attempt to try to take what we had been doing for years and ground it into questions of spatial justice. And so what I want to do is just talk a little bit about how this has played out and what are some of the ways in which this is emerging for us. We've been, as an empirical kind of urban ecologist who's out in the field, who likes to pore over data sets, who likes to also do a lot of social engagements, I've been able to work on projects that really ground this climate science in participatory approaches. Much like CBPR or community-based participatory research, what we're trying to do is get communities to go out, collect various different types of measurements, and help to define, design, and ultimately interpret and apply the results of what it is that we've done. It's a very kind of engaged process that takes quite a bit of time, though what we do in this particular case is to build on how Eric has set up the stage for urban heat, which kills more people than any other natural disasters, the pandemic notwithstanding, or at least the pandemic, not including the pandemic. The measurements that we do with communities is around trying to assess something that that we as individuals are very familiar with, temperature, and something children have been measuring for a very long time about fevers and things like that. And it's something that's relatively intuitive. We essentially are able to equip communities with these very sensitive research grade thermometers and that tell you temperature, humidity, and a few other things. And they're equipped on bicycles, on cars, and they go out and engage in a process after working with us to get trained up in this participatory climate science approach. And that leads to a collection of about tens of thousands, I'm sorry, my dogs are, tens of thousands of measurements in each place. And so what that ends up offering us is a way to look at this at scale all across the entire country. If you excuse me 1 second, I got to close this door because it's very loud with the dogs. The marvels of working from my home office here. But what we've now embarked upon with support from National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration is these campaigns where we've done this across cities around the country and increasingly around the world, where we're really trying to work with communities to collect these temperature measurements. Now, we've done this in a lot of places, including my current hometown of Portland, Oregon, where we embarked on this back in 2010, and we started based on some of the work that Eric did in Chicago, we started going out and measuring these distribution of temperatures across a city. So here's a literally an empirical, spatially explicit description of the heat distribution in the morning across the city of Portland, Oregon. And what's really interesting for us is we were able to collect these measurements and see at a very hyper local or high resolution scale, what is it that the temperature is in a specific location at a specific time. So we did this in the morning. We looked at the afternoon. The temperature actually shifts, and then we looked at the evening. And these were ways for us to show how it's not a monolithic one temperature for one city. It was actually a little bit more of these things vary by neighborhood. These things vary by street. And when we looked at this a little more closely and we started examining who was living in some of the hottest places in this particular city, we were finding these consistent patterns where communities living in the hottest parts of Portland included those that had less formal education, limited English proficiency, higher levels of racial diversity, extreme poverty, and that white identifying communities were more likely to have central AC, and Asian and older adults were less likely to have access to the public health heat refuges that were set up around the city and region. And interestingly, as we've now scaled this, we've started seeing this pattern all around the country. And this was something that's happening not just here in Portland, it was happening in it's happening in Roanoke, Virginia. It's happening in Houston, Texas. It's happening all over in this very similar pattern. And one of the things that's come up for us is this reckoning of, asking my scholars, why do we see these patterns? And I was hearing from many people this notion of, I guess it was often called the luxury effect, the notion that, an individual who has lots of money or access to financial resources could go about planting trees, creating shade, curating a landscape, and reducing the acute effects of heat in and around their neighborhood. That was deeply unsatisfying to me and others. And we were trying to look at more systemic ways of why these patterns did exist. And so we embarked on a deeper study that started to examine the way in which federal planning decisions that were made in the 1930s, namely redlining, had played out in cities around the country. And these decisions that were very consistent with segregation policies that had been around long before redlining, though this federal policy codified it into a set of neighborhood grades that would essentially have greater or limited access to home mortgages. And so not to get too deep into this redlining process, but I do want to emphasize that there was one organization, the Homeowners Loan Corporation, that essentially administered this at the federal level, working with local planning agencies and consultancies to essentially delineate these 4 different grades of color, essentially, in cities. The red being known as drawn red lines around, which were grade D, which was considered hazardous. The yellow was grade C, which is definitely declining in the official language. Grade B, which was considered still desirable, which is the blue, and the green is the considered the best, if you will, the green grade A for these cities. And this was done in over 200 cities across the country. And in recent years, the University of Richmond digitized these maps. And as a sociospatial scientist, this was a delicious data set for me. And I immediately was pulled to it with some other colleagues. We started looking at the relationship between these historic policies of segregation and what might be playing out in current day climate-induced impacts. Were there spatial inequities that exist today that were a result of these past planning policies that we can clearly document and clearly delineate? And so that's where this work really took on a life of its own, where we started looking at 108 different cities across the country. Those are the ones we could get access to. And we looked at, using satellite imagery, essentially looked at what was going on in these individual cities, and was there a relationship between historic redlining and current day temperatures that communities would be exposed to. And that's where we found some really interesting results. We found, for example, when it comes to green spaces, that the A grade neighborhoods, so that's the green here, were consistently having more tree canopy at the national scale of these 108 cities, as opposed to their red line counterparts in the red here. And that was a pattern that held out whether we looked at the Midwest, Northeast, West, or South. It was just all in all throughout the country. We looked further at what was on the landscapes of the Homeowners Loan Corporation security ratings, A, B, C, and D. Was there impervious surface? Was there tree canopy? What was going on there? And we were able to start to develop a narrative that showed very clearly that we were seeing very deliberate and conscious planning actions that would, in the 1950s, put highways right through the lowest land rent areas that, by design and definition, were the red-lined and yellow-lined areas of cities. And so the big highway projects, the big box stores, the industrial facilities, the housing projects, would all find their way into these land-hungry developments, would find their way into these historically C and D grade neighborhoods. And this was well after redlining was stopped in 1968 through the Fair Housing Act, through a string of civil rights actions that happened through the 60s. And yet what we're seeing is that this particular long shadow cast by that policy was still playing out in what we're seeing in terms of the land cover in each of these specific neighborhoods today. It got a little bit more, for me at least, interesting because we were able to look at this city by city, and for really surprisingly, in some ways very surprising, because I had heard kind of about Chicago through Eric, I'd heard about Baltimore through various other colleagues, New York, various other cities. The city I was living in, Portland, Oregon, ranked #1 as the difference in temperatures, current day temperatures, between the red-lined and their green-lined neighborhoods. And that, to me, was really stark because it was almost a 13 degrees Fahrenheit difference between one neighborhood and another neighborhood. This was the same difference we were finding in our air temperature maps as we went throughout the country. And so this was kind of telling a story about systemic processes that played out. A couple of last sets of data I want to present just before I sign off here and open it up to discussion, is the idea that even today, when you look at population change, where are populations going into cities? And we looked across these West Coast cities, and the y-axis here is percentage. That's a decimal point, but it's really a percentage, 10, 20, 30%, for example. And across the y-axis is the Holt grades. And whether it's Oakland, Los Angeles, Berkeley, Sacramento, or Portland, the population growth, which suggests large infrastructure projects as well, namely housing infrastructure, are finding their way into C and D neighborhoods far more so than they are into the A and B neighborhoods. And finally, the last bit of empirical information that we're examining is if greening efforts are happening in cities in various ways, whether they be tree plantings, whether they be parks and open space, as means of reducing temperatures, where has that green space been going? And we looked over the roughly 36 years here to examine the relationship between where greening was happening and where essentially whether it was happening in A and B neighborhoods or C and D neighborhoods. And this was a ratio that was very simple for us to calculate, which told us that Philadelphia, for example, was putting a lot more greening into their A and B neighborhoods, even in the last 30 plus years than they had in the past, similar to what they had in the past. And Los Angeles had kind of gone up and down, and even other cities like Portland was increasing the inequity over time until about 2004. And then we started seeing a lot more of an shift towards planting in C and D neighborhoods. And so I want to leave us with a couple of questions to provoke you, and a couple of provocations after this as well, just to kind of ground the discussion that we'll have in a minute. But to ground the effort, if we're really looking at this and going forward, these historic patterns are telling us something about where inequities are playing out very directly. And if we're grounding this effort in the principle that all individuals have the right to be protected from climate-induced events, then which communities are experiencing the most acute harms would really be a lens through which we would start thinking about interventions. I would also suggest that if we are shifting the burden of proof away from individuals and to systemic processes, like this case of heat has hopefully started to show, then the processes, organizational policies, management practices that center historically marginalized communities will need to be another lens through which we think about spatial justice. And then finally, what I would encourage us to think about a bit more is thinking about adopting a public health model of prevention as a preferred strategy to eliminate the threat before it occurs. What can be, in this case, what can be done to reduce the effects of climate change on the public's health? I'm going to skip over this. This is a lot of work happening here in terms of interventions that we're involved with. I'll be happy to chat about this. We're asking questions about transportation, community awareness, social vulnerability, the built environment, and housing policy across these cities that we're working in. And then the last three closing provocations that I want to at least maybe encourage us to think about is the idea that the systems that created these inequities have not changed. So it's similar to Eric's closing remarks, I think, where he was asking about, how is it we're going to be deciding where and how to invest these resources? And what I would propose to a response is that these systems are still essentially amplifying inequities. We're seeing whether it's greening policies, whether it's distribution of heat, whether it's even recently some flooding research that's emerging around where pluvial flooding is occurring has become a very interesting question. And then simply moving trees or interventions into disinvested neighborhoods can further amplify inequities. And then finally, to kind of come around full circle to this community-based participatory climate science agenda that I'm really getting deeper immersed into is this need for community-based neighborhood scale engagement campaigns that center on current needs and sharing power. So a lot of consistent themes across our two presentations, and I'm hoping we can get into a little bit more of a spirited discussion in the coming minutes. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen and open it up. Hopefully that worked out okay.
Thank you so much, Vivek, for your provoking questions and presenting a case study and showing how community members have been mobilizing to participate in research to monitor heat in their own communities and showing how the policies of segregation, of redlining have resulted in spatial inequities, having more asphalt in more communities, dissecting neighborhoods with highway projects, lack of green spaces, et cetera, and how that contributes to what communities are dealing with right now.